So I think the comparative case study approach has several advantages. It tries to blend the flexibility of case study work with the careful cultural and social work of ethnography, of network ethnography and comparative case study or extended case study method, these sorts of, or actor network theory inspired work. So these sorts of contemporary approaches to qualitative work are the things that we're drawing on in the approach. And so the advantages are that it's a more rigorous understanding or a richer understanding of key concepts that have long been used in case study work, but have been, I would say, in some ways misunderstood or inappropriately used. And those concepts in particular are culture, context, and comparison. So those, I think, are some of the advantages of using this particular approach to case study work. So the comparative case study approach encourages scholars to think about three axes of comparison. One is a horizontal axis to compare across sites, like across 6 schools, or to compare a school to a health clinic, to an after school, to a public plaza or a plaza or public space of some sort. So there's that horizontal comparison. The second axis of comparison is the vertical axis, which is to think across what we sometimes call levels and what we sometimes call scales, to think about how policies and trends and even discourses are traveling between the local, or what we think of as the local, to the regional, to the state, to the national, to the international. And so that's the second axis. And we have been trying to draw on critical geography and on the notion of scale to think about that relationship as we look at policies and how they travel. The third axis is more historical. It's called the transversal, to situate the object of interest or the phenomenon of interest in a historical way. So your question asks about the approach and its value for looking at policy at particularly international and national levels. And I think the value then of the approach is that it allows us to think about those scales and how they're socially constructed, both culturally, what the meaning making is around them, and then what kind of strategic essentialism is being performed within those levels and across those levels to make certain kinds of claims for policy or certain kinds of claims for legitimacy, and to make certain to support certain power relationships or hierarchies. And I think the comparative case study approach then, with its vertical axis, allows us to think using some rigorous qualitative approaches, allows us to think about policy production and policy appropriation and implementation across those scales. That's a great question. There are many challenges. Many challenges come to mind immediately of doing this kind of comparative work in educational policy. One obvious challenge is access. I'm in the field of anthropology, and the anthropology Laura Nader talked about studying up, right? Studying upper class or upper middle class, or studying powerful bureaucracies. And obviously access is a very difficult issue there. And so even if you secure access, it's difficult to get extended access to really do any kind of in-depth qualitative work beyond a one-off interview. So access is a very difficult problem. I think many scholars then face the challenge that the institutions that they're studying are often particularly powerful and will likely read the kind of analyses that are done about them and may have particular opinions about that. So let me give you a specific example. I had a good friend and colleague named Jill Koyama, who was interested in studying in the US. There are some fairly powerful companies that provide test prep. And she was working in several of these companies and interested in writing about how they influenced and benefited from the No Child Left Behind policy that mandated after-school tutoring. But she had to be very careful about first getting access to those companies and then how she could write about the things that she observed and the people she interviewed, knowing that these companies were likely going to have access to her written analyses and could take umbrage, could take offense at what they read. And so I think representations and questions of politics, and once you write something, are you going to have any access in the future, or are future scholars going to have access? That's a second challenge. A third challenge that I think of immediately is for anyone trying to do research that has multiple sites. How do you include all those sites? How do you work at those sites in any depth, right? It's certainly possible to spend a few days at multiple sites, but how do you really do the kind of in-depth, careful, qualitative research that we aspire to do? So those are three challenges I think of immediately, although there are many more related to relationships and ethics and the politics of doing research. You asked me, though, not only about challenges, but about opportunities, right? And so I do think that there are many opportunities for working in multiple sites and at multiple scales. And the biggest opportunity that I see is that it allows us to work, let's say an early part of your study might be at a single site. It allows you to do very careful qualitative research and do some analysis, come up with some findings and develop theory that you can then look at in the context of other places or other scales. And so it's a way to use comparison across scales and across sites in ways that I think can really strengthen the theoretical generalizability that we're able to claim on the basis of qualitative research.